today we are going to jump into how plants help the world, basically. How plants help Mother Earth. We're going to hit on four main topics. Most important, is we're going to talk about how plants can relate to other things in our environment that we don't think about every day. How they are going to produce oxygen and help us in natural disaster relief situations. It's fine. Little baby plants? Yeah, they're cool, aren't they? You guys have one of these at home, I think, don't you? Yeah, you do. This one has lots of holes. Look at all those holes. We'll talk about how the plants are going to help us regulate our water sources as well and water resources. We're going to talk about how they are our main energy source and what they do for us and our food, and of course our wonderful climate change challenges we run into. So our big one in our first one is oxygen and natural disaster relief, right? Or recovery, I should say. I shouldn't say relief, recovery. But oxygen and our natural disaster recovery are probably the two biggest things that our trees offer to us in our natural environment, right? Plants naturally help us clean the air, right? That's why using natives is always a really great tool in our landscape for so many other reasons as well. But one of the big ones is that the stronger a plant can perform, the better it can help the environment, right? So if we've got plants that are thriving in our areas, such as our natives that we use in our landscapes, right, we are going to have better success at that plant surviving, which means ultimately it is going to help produce more oxygen and help us clean the air even more. Aside from natives, of course, being benefit to our wildlife, etc., right, that is going to be one major piece of having a successful landscape. The other piece is that the plants help protect our soil from erosion, right? We see this used often on creek sides and things of that nature. If we have a creek that has been kind of scalped on one side, we will naturally see a lot more erosion happening, right? But the strong root systems are going to help with that purpose. Even in our small square footages of our yards, right, in our captured space, there's so much a plant can do for our erosion. A lot of times we'll use plants in the landscape to help erosion along foundation lines as well, right? So we use that quite often. And then obviously plants are releasing their nutrients to help keep our soils fertile and healthy. When the plant is absorbing nutrients, they are also releasing nutrients into the soil, right? Specifically when we get into our large trees and such, one that we all love to see around town is the live oaks, right? These guys are producing bionutrients that they're pushing out into the soil. So again, going to that native side and why our natives are so important. But that is what helps us in things like our disaster recoveries, right? So trees are also offering protection in storms, even though they can cause some damage in storms, right? But they are also offering us protection in storms in that way. But in things like when we think about wildfires and such, right, the plants are going to be what helps replenish the health of the soil back, right? They're going to reactivate the soil for us. And usually what we see tend to grow the most out of our natural fires. Floods is another really good example. But trees are one of the very first things that start to sprout back in nature, right? So those guys are kind of the key to a healthy landscape in that way. Water resources. Plants also help regulate our water resources. One really cool fact is that about 10% of the water in the form of vapor is put back into the atmosphere. So when our plants are drinking up our water and we think about watering our plants, about 10% of that water is put back into the atmosphere in the form of a vapor. Essentially, think about a plant sweating almost, right? It's putting it back into the atmosphere in that way. It's going to help us restock for our next rainfall, right? It's also helping us with our climate temperature by doing that evaporation process. What you got?
Flowers help when sometimes honeybees come and eat the pollen.
You're 100% right. And that's how they make their honey. That's why the honey tastes so sweet. Bees are good for the environment, right? That's what helps keep them blooming. Did you know even the trees create a pollen that the bees like? Even those big old shade trees? The bees and moths even help the big trees bloom. That's pretty cool. So the other thing that trees in a lot of our shrubs, especially that we're going to see are used in our landscapes here in Central Texas, they're going to help with our water runoff too, right? If you've ever seen a lot of these construction sites that are completely torn apart and they've scalped the ground, right? In a heavy rain, all that water is just rushing right off, right? So the plants are going to help slow that down. Saves our city a lot of money. The greener our yards are too, right? But it's going to help filter that water as well. So not only is it going to be able to help collect and keep it on the property to help infiltrate into the soil, it's going to be kept on site in that fashion, but we're going to also help filter it. So the root systems of these plants are acting like a natural fibrous filter system, right? Live oaks are a great example of that because they've got all those lateral roots, right? Pecans go really, really deep, but they've got all their feeder roots that really help with that, right? And like I said, all of our trees and shrubs, for that matter, really help with that filter process, basically. Rain gardens. Are you guys familiar with rain gardens? No, okay. So rain gardens are a pretty cool way to help this process. So rain gardens are basically designed to create a depression in the ground and mound on the low side of the property, basically, right? And so what that's going to do is basically help us capture and catch the water. The landscape guide, they had, this is the new version, I don't know if it's in this one. Oh, maybe they don't have it anymore. They had a little section in the back about rain gardens. I believe they still have the handout. Let me see if they've got that real quick. Yeah, so rain gardens basically create a little depression in the ground, which allows our surface water or our runoff water to go into, to sit and to hold it on site to prevent it to run off into our stormwater runoffs. And then ideally, like you can see in this diagram here on the second page, you create in the berm situation, so if we've got a natural slope to our yard, we create a berm on the low side of that slope, which will help hold and capture the water. And basically the goal there that we're creating with a rain garden is to hold as much of that storm water on our property as possible. And then we use plants like grasses, native small trees, and a lot of like ground covers and such to help filter that water runoff, right? On the back of the sheet, they do a really good job at highlighting the most effective plants to use in a rain garden. Great places to use rain gardens are areas like off of gutters. If you've got a peak or an eave of your roof that comes together that always sheds a lot of water. A lot of times we'll use them in our landscape plans at the edges of properties to capture that kind of last sediment before it runs off again into the street and into our gutter systems, right? And they can be so many different forms. I do really like the one that they put on the front here because it's not a standard design to it, where it's a little bit more of a captured space. And you'll notice that that's just a few foot off of the foundation, so I'm sure it's also capturing a lot of the runoff from the roof itself. There's a really great example that the city created right where, what is that? It's Cesar Chavez and Lamar, right where the two roads come together, where they put in the new pedestrian bridge. There's the power plant, the old power plant project, right? It is on, gosh, what would that be on? That would be on the northeast corner of the lake where, is it Cesar Chavez or do they call it Barton's? It's Cesar Chavez, I think, right? Yeah, Cesar Chavez and Lamar where they come together. That northeast corner of the intersection, there's kind of the roundabout if you're coming northbound on Lamar, right? And it loops around. Right in there is a massive rain garden that the city created. And they created that because of the watershed from the apartment complex that's right next to the railroad track, right? When they put that in, that was a natural depression that allowed the water to come across and make it to the lake, right? But once they kind of leveled that space out for that development, they lost the ability for that water to shed into the lake anymore, right? So what they did is they created that large rain garden there. And it's one of the most successful ones that the city's done so far. Outside of their offices, the Grow Green and in the egg extension offices on Barton Springs and South First. They also have it inside the median between South First and their office parking lot. They've got a very elongated rain garden that they did there as well. That's a nice one. It's just a much smaller scale and a little more captured. They don't get quite as much runoff in that space. One of the early things that we learned about rain gardens along the way too is that we were using things that wanted high water because we were thinking, hey, we're capturing all of this runoff and this water in this space. We need plants that can handle that extra water. And so what we did is we actually switched to plants that do the extremes better. So things like yuccas and such. Yes, sir?
Butterflies also drink pollen.
They do. And then they help the plants bloom more. You got this. You're so smart. I love it. You're great. But they realized really quickly that we needed plants that can handle the extremes more, right? So that they can handle the really wet conditions and then the really dry conditions. One question that always comes up is about mosquitoes with rain gardens, because we're talking about a space that we're going to capture and hold all this water. And on, I think it's step 3, in calculating the size, it'll talk about what size you need and how to do a water test. Sorry, step 2 is where it talks about testing the soil for a water test. Really, we want a rain garden to drain within a 24-hour period, right? So we should prep this soil just like we would a normal garden. So the idea is I typically tell people, dig out your depression, create your berm, right? And then prep your soil as if you would any garden bed. So add in your composts and such. I typically add in quite a bit of expanded shale when we're doing ours because of that heavy clay content that we have, right? So I'll often add in the expanded shale just to help get that oxygen and that breathability for the soil, and that's going to help that water penetrate through and into the soils. When you're calculating your space, in step 3, yep, there it is, where they've got the diagram that they used, you'll notice that they kind of planned that one straight off of a gutter range, right? Or a gutter downspout for where the water mostly comes from. So they don't have to be very big to be effective, but you can mix them right into your current garden beds too. It doesn't need to be its own captured garden bed. You can create a garden bed within a landscape, which is another reason I like that photo on the front example that they have there. You can see it's kind of part of the landscape and the garden bed itself. Let's see, any other big questions on rain gardens? All good? Cool. Really great technique though. Again, with our heavy clays, water runoff is such a big thing in our area that if we can prevent that, we also capture the water. A lot of times what will happen is the water that can shed can go off into another aquifer that's not as useful for us, kind of concept, right, to our own space. Awesome. All right, so biodiversity and energy resource, right? So obviously our plants, our trees, especially our evergreens and our large shade trees, become habitats for the wildlife. You go. You're good.
Ladybugs are surrounded, and ladybugs can also fly.
They can fly. You're right. That's how they get from one plant to the next, right?
Yeah.
Did you know that ladybugs are also really, really good bugs? They help eat the bad bugs.
They eat tiny bad bugs.
They do. They can save a whole plant. So whenever you see a ladybug, you got to protect it, right? They're good for the garden.
Because if a mosquito came, I will just use my suit on the floor and then kick it.
There you go. Don't love mosquitoes, huh? Mm-mm. Yeah, yeah. Not a big fan of them.
I used to get lots of mosquito bites.
Ugh. Don't love mosquitoes. Not my favorite. So obviously, you know, the trees are going to provide that habitat for wildlife, right? So that's obviously a huge plus. The more we continue to develop our cities and our urban spaces, our urban sprawl, as they say, the most important piece is to continue to provide those habitats, right? We can't push wildlife out. We are part of wildlife in that way, right? So we want to incorporate as much as we can. Obviously, using natives again, I can't stress that enough. I think we all agree on that one, but we can't use them enough, right? Plants also provide us nutrients, right? When we think about our plants and such, and where all of our food comes from, you know, when we're talking about eating breakfast, lunch, and dinner, or getting a snack, we have to remember it all comes from nature, right? So our plants are providing us the food that we need, but our plants are also providing our food, right? Yes, exactly. You know, and it's always funny whenever I talk about that, how many people kind of go, oh, yeah, that's a good point, you know. But it's true, you know, we have to remember every time we are kind of doing our sprawl, as we do, right, nature plays an amazingly key role in that, that we don't get to see every day, right, because we've made food very easy for us. So it's really important that we remember we need to feed that as best we can, right? Oh, well, I skipped one, I think. How do I go back? There it goes. Reducing the climate change. That one's always kind of a given to most plant people, right? But the idea is that we can use plants to help filter all of these carbons in our air, right? We know that because as we continue to learn more about what damage fossil fuels do in our environment, right? We want plants like our oak trees and our pines and our spruces and our yopons in our areas because these guys eat an insane amount of carbons, right? So we want them to absorb that to help filter that out of the air for us, right? If we like the air we breathe, we need to go thank an oak tree today, right? But these guys will basically, what they do to process that is they're going to absorb all of those carbons, dioxides, and hold it, basically, right? That's what they're going to use partially as their photosynthesis process for growing, right? So they're bringing that in, they're going to process it, and what they release in return is oxygen, right? So they kind of have a opposite filter system from us, right? We're breathing in the oxygen and putting out the rest, whereas these guys are bringing in the bad and putting out the good, right? So that's where plants are really, really going to come into a key process for us. In our area, oaks, pines, spruces, yopons, we see those used a lot in our landscapes. Keep using them, right? I mean, that's the best way you can do. I did bring a couple of plants for our indoor selection too, because a lot of folks always ask that. Basically, hey, what's a good oxygenator for the interior? When we go inside, one thing to understand about plants that are producing oxygen, honestly, this goes for our outdoor plants as well, but one thing to understand about our indoor ones specifically is there is no plant that's necessarily producing more oxygen than another. It's about the length of time of day that it produces the oxygen. So things like sansevierias and the spats produce 24/7, right? So they're constantly producing, and which means they're absorbing the bad. That's similar with things like oaks and our yopons and such, right? So it's allowing more oxygen to be produced, but it's not necessarily that they are producing more in a short amount of time, right? So it's just a matter of understanding which ones are constantly producing versus which ones only produce with their photosynthesis during the day or night kind of concept, right? But yeah, oaks, can't stress them enough, they're great. The Grow Green guide that I know you guys both already have one at home too, I'm sure, do a really great job in some of their notes on the large tree section where they talk about what is super native to our area. Again, going back to the idea, if something is native, it's going to thrive in its home. If it's thriving, it's growing, which means it's able to produce more oxygen for us, right? So another just important key factor of using those natives. And then, of course, reduce and reuse everything that you possibly can, right? We were kind of making a joke that we decorated today with some balloons, one-time use plastic on Earth Day, right? But I wanted to highlight that this is their third use. So they were used for a birthday party, and then we had a private event last night that she then donated to us, and I was like, they're so beautiful, I don't want to just throw them away. How can we use them, right? So this is technically their third life, right? We use our bins over here by the dumpsters. I don't know if you guys are familiar or not, but we reuse our grow pots, any scrap wood, and cardboards that we have, things that could be useful in the garden, right? We reuse a lot of stuff on the floor, right? We have reused materials that were here when we took over our site. A lot of our shelves, the pottery shelves that we have in the back, all existed here. We just cleaned them up, tidied them up kind of thing, and reused them. We reuse anywhere in any shape that we can. This wood rack right here is all scrap wood. We break down most of our pallets to build a lot of our displays. If they're temporary displays, I don't let us buy new wood for those. We have to reuse for those. So it's a challenge that we find ourselves doing. The large decorative wall in tropicals is all pallet wood. I think we bought one board for another project that got used for that project kind of thing. So we kind of trying to challenge ourselves in the store also to reuse as much as we possibly can when creating these displays, right? Another thing is compost. So those are things that we can do at home, right? So again, that's one-time use taken out of the roll. So now we're using things multiple times. Veggie scraps. You know, if you're growing your veggies, you prep your veggie and you eat it, any of the scraps and offcuts go straight into your compost, you're reusing it again, right? So there's so many ways that we can keep all of these resources right on our small bits of land in this big old earth that we have, right? There's so many different ways, though, that you can get creative with that in the landscape. Again, you can also reuse pallets for creating raised beds in your compost bins and such, right? So there's so many different ways that we can reuse these materials. Cardboards. We all have to shop in life, right? You get a lot of cardboard these days in your paper. Those are great for weed barriers in our landscapes, right? So it's a great way to slowly kill out your lawn and such. Yeah. So cardboard's a great way. So if you're going to expand like a garden bed or you're just battling weeds really heavily, you pull back your mulch if it's already a bed. If it's not a bed, I typically just lay down the cardboard on top of the area that I need to kind of solarize, if you will, and then put mulch on top. And then I water my mulch in so it kind of locks in, if you will. But as that cardboard composts and kind of decomposes, right, it's also killing off the grass and such that's underneath it without adding harsh chemicals and such into the lawn and landscape. So it's a longer process, right? But when we're talking about nature and we're looking at an oak tree like this little baby right here, who can grow to be 800 years old, right? 3 extra weeks to kill off the lawn doesn't seem all that bad, right? But it's a way to prevent putting in chemicals into the lawn when you don't need to, right? Weed killers and things of that nature. Even though we strongly only suggest the vinegar is still technically harmful to a lot of the microorganisms in our soil, right? It's a pretty potent chemical even though it's organic and natural, right? There are much worse things to use, of course, right? But yeah, that's why, cardboard can be used in so many different fashions in the landscape. Most of the time with your cardboards, you do want to be cautious of your inks and such that are printed on them. So the big colorful cardboard's probably not the best use for that, right? But yeah, your Amazon packages that are mostly brown cardboard, untouched kind of concept, right? I mean, those are great uses for doing that. I just expanded my bed a couple months ago, and I went that route, and it's really helpful. Yeah. I'm sorry? It takes about 3 weeks to really get the success for the cardboard to kind of break down and kind of mat that turf underneath. And it depends on the season. So like right now in the growing season, when the lawn wants to grow and you're killing off lawn, it's a much quicker process because if it can't grow and it's going to die off, right? But like in winter and things of that nature, it can take a little bit longer. You also like the heat that the mulch is producing from its composting process with the cardboard, right? And so that also helps. So in a warmer months, it's a little faster. You can also use things like plastics, like black plastic, like a black trash bag kind of plastic, right? And you can weight that down on its edges, and that's the actual solarization process where the heat is actually burning off the foliage and the roots and such. What's nice about that process is it's also adding moisture typically to the soil. So it keeps the soil a little bit healthier, depending on kind of what you're working with. These books right here, Teeming with Nutrients and Teeming with Microbes, are awesome breakdowns of those kind of those micronutrients we're talking about in the soil there. They do really, really well at highlighting all of that. And tomorrow actually is World Book Day, so all of our books are going to be 20% off, just a heads up. So it's going to be kind of a one-day only thing, but if you're looking at those and considering those, I would definitely say grab those tomorrow. That'll be available online too, if you guys want to grab it from home kind of thing. But those guys do really great at kind of breaking down, understanding what the nutrients and all those microbes are doing for the landscape, right? Like what are they even producing for the plants? How can I work with them? That kind of thing. But they've done a really good job with breaking that out in those. But yeah, cardboard, easy way to reuse it, right? Because it's most of the time, cardboard's just a one-time use thing, right? Similar to balloons. We love a balloon. It's pretty, it's beautiful, but if you only got one use out of it, you kind of start to reconsider the way you look at those things and how they affect the environment, right? Plant a tree. You know, I mean, that's the easiest way to get it started. When you're working in your landscape, don't think of just flowers, think about the longevity, right? Not just for you, but for the next generation, right? Or the generation after that kind of concept, right? Every home I've lived in, I've always planted 2 trees. It's been my thing. I'm going to make it be a thing forever kind of deal. I was in an apartment complex when I had first, you know, got my own place kind of thing, and I was like, I'm planting a tree here. There's no trees here. I'm planting trees, you know. They're like, I don't know what to tell you, kid. Great, I'll do it. But you know, it's as silly as it is, that's going to be the one thing that can leave the longest legacy, right? Again, when we're thinking about an oak who's going to grow to be 800 years old, and this is the baby that she is today, right? We're not doing this for us. We're doing it for the next step, right? And that's one thing we always want to try to remember when we're doing things like those one-time use materials. And that's where the bees come in. The bees are helpful, right? To keep our plants growing.
Some kind of tiny bugs, they are also helpers sometimes.
They do. They do help us. The tiny bugs are sometimes the best ones, honestly.
Some tiny bugs are not, and then they change into good ones.
You got it.
It's like when they're the little tiny dog ones, and then they turn into some, that's ladybugs, and they're tiny cuckoo.
They do. They turn into big, beautiful ones, huh? I love it. Some of them are kind of silly looking, though.
Yeah.
Yeah. But they're still good.
So what I was gonna say, so some kind of bugs that are tiny is they're also things that they also sometimes eat flowers, but the queen honeybees, they take big pieces of pollen.
They do, huh? Well, and the bugs need something to eat too, don't they? That's where the plants can help sometimes.
Also, these are the 2 trees that they're made out from trees.
Yep. They're good trees, huh? They're the good ones. Oh, actually, yep. Hopefully not. Hopefully they become big, big trees. I meant to point out too, in here, in the tree section, they will say, let's see, let me find one real quick. When we're talking about urban heat and such and planting trees that can provide us shade, they have a little indicator, the U and the A that's circled in here. The city of Austin considers those utility approved, is what that means. So it means that they're really good use for underneath power lines, because power lines have a specific height that they are put at, and typically these trees grow underneath that height at full maturity, so that they're not getting hacked at and needing additional maintenance, right? Because again, we get into pollutants, the more maintenance we need to do. And then their root systems are not typically aggressive root systems, meaning they are good to be placed near things like foundations or over underground utilities, and they're safe for that, or within, within distance of those. They are also good to put along the street lines, like curbs, like along our streets in that way. That'll also provide shade to things like the street, your driveways and stuff like that. So those are really great little indicators that the city's put together in this booklet for us that allow us to get a kind of a better grasp and understanding of where to put some of these trees. They typically, like I said, they base it on their height and then how aggressive their root systems tend to be.
Regarding grasses,
Yeah.
Bermuda is obviously not a native grass. To get rid of that,
Yep.
and put something like a mix.
Yep.
Um,
are crazy too, yeah. So the reason that Bermuda gets so widely used is because of the very deep root system that it's got, which also makes it a lot more drought tolerant than most lawns. It's a fast grower as well, right? So it's not one that requires a whole lot of maintenance necessarily in that way. The cardboard trick is a really good one for that. Solarization I've had a lot of success with, right? And that's just covering it with plastic for several weeks. The big one with that is you need the sun to produce the heat, right? So the kind of the cloudy days we've had lately would extend that time period. But basically when you peel it up and there's no more green left, you're kind of ready to go. It's nice when you're going to replace the lawn with a lawn to go that solarization route, because at that point you just do a little top dress of your compost and such, right? And you can go straight to seed. So that is a helpful tactic for that. It also helps heat up that root system that's so deep, whereas the cardboard method is just kind of killing it off, and there is still an opportunity of some regrowth from those. The longer you kept the cardboard on, of course, the more successful it would be, right? But yeah, you're basically wanting to block the sun as best you can in that way, without needing to scrape and scalp the lawn, right? Or the soil. Yeah, but yeah, the Native American seed mixes over here are really, really great. They make the shade-friendly grass mix, which is full of natives, and then they make this sun mix, which is this one, I think. Yeah, the sun turf, they call it, sorry, which is a really good mix as well. And most of these guys in here are going to be longer lengths, so they're typically anywhere from about 6 to 8 inches in height. So that is one thing to consider about your native grasses, is most of them are, most of them are going to be longer than your standard turf grass would be. This is another favorite of mine, is this prairie starter mix. This is also much taller, so not always the perfect lawn for kiddos to be playing in, but this has got a lot of really great mixes for edges of lawn, is what I usually tell people. You can kind of get that meadow look out of it, but this one is packed full of a bunch of the native grammas. This has also got the side oats, the little blue stem, the big blue stem, the Indian grass, the blue grommas, the buffalo grass, all of that's in this mix. So definitely more of a prairie aesthetic, like it says. But usually when I've used that, I've used it kind of at the borders, if you will, like almost at the edge of my like mowed spaces. But yeah, their sun mix is really great, and their shade mix is really great. Again, packed full of those natives. Also full of pollinators too.
Birds lay nests and sleep sometimes, and they also lay nests on houses.
They do, and they also nest in the grasses. Did you know that?
There's some that live in high trees that the leaves are falling off, and some are on the ground on the sidewalk.
Yeah? Did they fall out?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And sometimes some pigeons have baby birds.
My goodness, have you seen all of the pigeons here at Garden 17?
We see some flying up in the air.
I know it. There's
Then
so
that
many.
will lay some eggs.
Yes.
We saw some baby pigeons at my preschool.
That's cool.
And also we saw baby birds that are tiny at my neighbors. And also some at where we used to go on the highway.
Yeah. Birds are everywhere. That's why the trees are good for them, right? It gives them a place to hide and make a little home. They can get right in there and they get nice and protected.
And sometimes they lay eggs in biggest trees, just like that big.
I know. All the way at the tippy top, too, huh?
Yeah.
Yeah. It must be nice to have wings to fly.
Yeah.
Wouldn't that be nice?
But they will stay in their nest, and then their dad or mom will come and feed them.
Yeah. That's when they
But
squeak, huh?
we see some that are so fast, they're beating everything.
Do you have hummingbirds in your yard? I've got so many hummingbirds in my yard right now. They're so little and they're so fast. They're so fast.
Well, these beacon birds, he's just like so
He just zooms right by.
He just like eat everything before you see them.
That's why we gotta have trees. It's so fun to see them. But we need trees so they can nest in, right? Yeah.
I wish there would be some birds that lay nest in here.
Inside, you know, I've done so much work to move them outside. I did. I'm so sorry, yeah. They're a little messy to have inside, but they're nesting outside and we give them food outside.
And sometimes the birds are so sneaky they can just sneak inside.
They do. They sneak inside these doors sometimes, don't they?
Yeah.
They are sneaky. They are sneaky.
And sometimes when you're outside and they sneak in, you just come in here and you say, "We are those hungry birds," and then you just see them and just take them back outside.
Yeah, we have to sometimes. It's like a Snow White moment sometimes in the morning here. We open up the doors and the birds come flying.
Some birds just go from trees to flowers.
Yes.
But some kinds of birds, they eat little tiny streams of water and seeds.
Yep. They eat the seeds, right, from the plants after they bloom.
You're very smart.
Yeah.
They also fly away when something comes in danger.
When they're in danger?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Times of
Well, that's where
danger.
flying must be good, right? Because then they can fly right away from the danger and get all the way up at the top of the trees where they put their nests.
But also there's something cool about birds. Did you know that birds can also fly and use their claws on their feet to stable on trees?
That's a great way to use their feet, huh? Of course. I love it. Well, I appreciate you guys coming in today. Give a hug to a tree today, you know? Thank Mother Nature for our oxygen, right? Like I said, I think the biggest, I mean, you guys know this, you guys hear me say this enough, but the biggest thing I would stress is just always making sure we've got those natives, right? I mean, and if we can keep in that focus, that's where we end up with the most success as a whole for the planet, right? But yeah, if you guys ever have any questions, you know where to find us. We're here. Thank you guys.